Hello, I'm Luke Stoddard-Nathan, news editor at The Alt. I'm joined by Katie Cusack, music editor at The Alt, and David Howard King, editor and associate publisher at The Alt.
Hi.
We are here today to shoot a little intro for an interview that David conducted with Chet Hardin, former Metroland reporter, who covered NXIVM for a long time, which has been back in the news lately. David, do you think you could give us a little bit of a rundown, and we'll help if it's complicated, of what has happened with NXIVM and news around NXIVM? And what is NXIVM, or what was NXIVM?
Well, so the most recent sort of goings on, and we wrote the feature. I wrote a feature a few weeks ago that sort of checked in after Keith Raniere, who's the head of this self-help group. It's sort of like an empowerment Tony Robbins sort of thing that executives do, and other people who want to feel like they have a way to drastically change their lives by giving themselves over to something. Get involved, and it's been a part of the region for quite some time, and it's actually like a global enterprise in some ways now, although it's falling apart. But
sort of headquartered in Clifton Park.
Clifton Park, yeah. And Keith Raniere is this, I believe he was the first triple major from RPI.
Right.
And he basically built this cult of personality around himself that looks to have become a cult. And last September, I believe it was, the New York Times ran a story about how women who joined a certain part of this group were getting branded and forced into basically sexual slavery. After that, around that time, Keith ditched the country. They found him in Mexico, I think last month. There was an FBI joint raid with Mexican authorities. Keith was there with a number of women, and some of them starlets who he had converted. He was arrested. They chased him in a car. I mean, very dramatic stuff. And
the women who were with,
the women,
right,
not the FBI.
Right.
They actually chased the authorities.
Right.
So Keith has since been in jail in New York and had a hearing. And before he was indicted officially, they also arrested Allison Mack,
right,
Smallville actress, who it appears to have been his partner in recruiting women for this part of the cult or alleged cult that recruited women and put them into sexual slavery, and branded them with what insiders say is both his initials and her initials, depending on how you look at them.
And the long and short of what they're accused of is what exactly?
Human trafficking, and forced sex,
right.
And I believe more charges are actually coming. There's a lot of talk that Allison Mack may flip because these are a lot of charges.
Right. She's been released on a $5 million bond, I believe.
Yeah.
Right.
And to her family in California, right. And she's not allowed to talk to anyone that has anything to do with NXIVM. So Chet, who I spoke to, was former news editor of Metroland, and I was actually in the newsroom with Chet back in 2006 when he started covering this, and I remember it being, as we talked about in the article, pretty unbelievable. And Chet being worried for his safety, Chet being worried that folks were following him. But you have to realize the stuff he initially reported showed that these guys were hiring really professional, seasoned investigators, groups that stalked folks and were able to, it appeared from some of his initial reporting, had broken into someone's bank account to check in on them, a guy who was involved in cult deprogramming. It looked like they had tried to lure someone into a compromising position. And since then, and Chet's written a lot. He was about them when he was at Metroland. He wrote a lot about them. They were in contact with him, and it looked like they basically tried to buy him off and hire him. And other journalists obviously have faced major lawsuits. It had a major impact on the Times Union. I think it intimidated and silenced a lot of critics, but now it's at a critical mass where I don't think there's anything they can do to put the genie back in the bottle. And it's obviously turned into this national scandalous story, and it involves sex and celebrities. So
right.
I think the major point that Chet makes is that it's past the point of what matters, which is this group that had a ton of influence, a ton of money, was basically able to pull the wool over a lot of people's eyes in the area because they had money and power. but also use their money and celebrity to protect themselves from actual prosecution. And a number of times they've used the court system and even the state to go after their critics or people who were trying to analyze them more. So,
and Schneiderman's office had opened some sort of investigation related to that.
Right.
That stemmed sort of from that New York Times story, but they've since kind of tabled that investigation, from what I understand, as the federal investigation unfolds, I believe.
Yeah, they handed it over to the feds. But yeah, I mean, these people had relationships with local politicians. Former state Senate Majority Leader Joe Bruno, who was in power for decades, was a big beneficiary of their donations, and as were a number of local politicians. And we know they donated to Hillary Clinton pretty heavily. So I think there's a lot more to the story that's going to come out that's past whether Allison Mack was tweeting at Emma Watson about joining the cult. And of course, it's not, it's no small thing that she was trying to recruit people for a sex cult. But the way that they got away with this and the way that they were able to spread throughout the region because of their power and influence is, I think, what's most frightening, that people weren't willing to challenge them because they were litigious and had a lot of money.
Well, it's a fascinating story. Seems like more to come. So with that, I guess enjoy this interview between David Howard King and Chet Hardin, former Metroland reporter.
Thanks. Yeah. So, Chet, thanks for joining me today. Obviously, you were a big part of the feature that we ran 2 weeks ago, I believe, about basically your early reporting on NXIVM and the idea now that this has become so prominent, but you were ahead of the game, and the folks who you reported on had to wait years to have their stories told and actually heard by a larger audience, and finally it looks like perhaps get some justice. So can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to watch this unfold after obviously starting to report on this in 2006, 12 years later, seeing this all unfold in such a large public fashion?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just talking to Tony Natali, who was the focal point of my original 2006 article, and we've always been, Tony and I have always wanted to write a book together about this, and we always joked that we've tried before, and we're like, well, we don't really have an ending. You can't write a book when there's no ending. And
right.
for a long time, it never seemed like NXIVM, like there was going to be an end to this story. I mean, it seems so obvious that this was all going to collapse one day. But 4 years ago, that wasn't the case.
Right.
I mean, 4 years ago, they seemed literally untouchable. So I was joking with Tony. I was like, we always knew we were going to write a book together, but not in my wildest dreams that I think it was going to be under these circumstances. That I think that, that it would reach this sort of celebrity gossip level that it's reached. So it's vindicating to see it. It's also a little frustrating to have waited for so long for it to happen. But yeah, I mean, I'm grateful, and I think everybody involved in this. I think everybody involved in this, in what has been, a 20-year struggle, is grateful. So.
And you've been pretty outspoken recently about the tenor of the coverage. You've sort of said that you feel that the label of sex cult just really doesn't sort of explain just how horrible this was, that this was not, something you see with happy orgies or something like that. You read about this was coerced sex and labor, and yet it's splashed across the pages of these gossip columns as though it's this salacious, fun sort of thing. Obviously now it's on Good Morning America and Page 6 and the New York Post. What do you want people to stay focused on as the story unfolds? What do you think the crux is?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you do lose. There is a chance that we're going to lose sight in all of this of what really matters. And I think what really matters, at least from my perspective, and what's kind of kept me engaged in this story for 12 years, is the level of abuse that the victims have had to deal with, and is amazing. You know, the what Tony Natali has been put through for almost 30 years. I mean, 20 years since she left Keith, but even while she was with Keith, there was abuse. So this sort of this abuse is overwhelming. But then the fact that people like Tony have not been believed for so long, it compounds the abuse. You wonder, you wonder if you're the crazy person in this situation. And I think that when people are put in these abusive situations, it's very hard to get people to believe them. And even when people start believing them, they turn it into a sex romp, right? And these sort of like this sort of like New York Post cover, and it's I don't know. I feel like it removes I feel like it doesn't do justice or service to what these women mostly have been put through.
And one of the other takeaways, we've talked about it. It was in the article a bit. It's been written about, but it's not getting the focus now that I think it should. It's the abuse of the legal system, NXIVM's ability to bury people under lawsuits. Yep. Obviously, they're in a different position right now because of all the publicity, and they're probably short on some funds, or at least, I mean, they have the Seeger mayors backing them up, so maybe not short on funds, but they don't have the same credibility and ability to use their funds, but perhaps the way they want to. But can you describe what it was like for Tony? And do you think there's a way to use this case to sort of change policies so that people can't do this to people?
I mean, I know that is Tony's desire out of all this, to see protections put in place for people who went through what Tony went through. They use the legal system largely because they had access to the Bronfmans' hundreds of millions of dollars, and they can chase a person who is a critic or who is just displeased them. They were able to chase these people through the legal system for years and years and years. Rick Ross, the cult deprogrammer, I think his case lasted 14 years.
Wow.
Tony has been in multiple courtroom settings with NXIVM, civil, and she's also been the target of criminal charges as well. So this takes a toll on a person, and a lot of people don't realize this, because thankfully a lot of people haven't been put in a situation where they're being sued relentlessly for years. But you can't just ignore, no matter how frivolous it is, no matter how blatantly sort of like, no matter how blatantly ridiculous the lawsuit is, you can't ignore it, and you have to answer the motions. You have to respond to what the other side's lawyers are doing. So for someone like Tony, who didn't have access to hundreds of millions of dollars, she was at such a disadvantage. The NXIVM lawyers were able to file every possible motion they wanted to. They were able to search out any venue they want. They can just bury you in legal fees until you give up. And luckily Tony doesn't give up. So, you know, she survived. Nothing they ever threw at her stuck. But it still is just destructive, you know, emotionally, financially, psychologically. It's very exhausting. I don't think there's been, in the 20 years since she left Keith Raniere, because maybe people don't know this too, she was Keith Raniere's sole girlfriend. Yeah, well, she thought, you know, she was his girlfriend for the better part of a decade. And so when she left Keith, that's when this nightmare of litigation began. And since she left him in 1999, there probably hasn't been total 12 months where she hasn't been in some sort of legal action. The toll is just unimaginable.
So obviously this is less important, but I think it's of interest to folks in the area. How ingrained were NXIVM and their followers in Troy and Saratoga and, you know, Clifton Park? I've heard since the story ran, I've heard from, you know, maybe 15 or 20 people who either took courses, were approached by the Knife of Aristotle folks from their publication, or who had drinks with them and were sort of propositioned by a member or something about, you know, coming to try one of their classes. How much of a part of our local community were they?
They were seen as a legitimate alternative to something like Tony Robbins. So they were seen as a legitimate, and they still are probably to some degree. There are still probably some people who see them this way, as a legitimate executive training program, a place where you could go to train yourself in skills that would help you succeed in your career, in your relationships, in your life in general. I mean, you know, even so far as like training for like athletic events, it was sort of seen as the Swiss Army knife of like success programs. Anything you want, you could get out of it. So, and yeah, they were very popular. I mean, I know Richard Branson says he didn't endorse them, but he had a long time to correct that misunderstanding. I think the first time I saw his name associated with them was in 2006 or 2007. So when he and Claire Bronfman were cuddling on a couch on Nectar Island, he could have easily said, "Hey, take my name off of that NXIVM thing," right? So it was because of things like that they had this sort of veneer of acceptability, and their language is all about peace and self-transformation and empowerment. And it's a good pitch, you know. It's a good pitch, and a lot of people fell for it. You know, if I hadn't been exposed to it the way I was through Tony Natali and Rick and others, if I hadn't been given that sort of preview and I just run into it in the wild, I probably would have fallen for it. It's very seductive, you know. It's very seductive to see happy young rich people talking about self-empowerment and peace and it can draw you in, and it drew a lot of people in. You go back and you look at the names that were associated to it. They're very powerful people who were either, you know, absolutely endorsed it or went through it or NXIVM just claimed they did. One way or the other, those names stick and they mean something.
I was in the newsroom with you for a large part of your reporting, and I recall, you know, obviously, and you've written about it, after doing your initial large feature, you started encountering the group more and representatives of the group more in Troy, and your friends interacted with them. So what was it like trying to, or watching those two worlds combine and trying to sort of explain this to your friend base? You know, obviously, yesterday we ran a story with a snippet of one of your stories where you had reported on Allison Mack meeting with then Troy Mayor Harry Tatunjan. I mean, it's just sort of like to think that these folks you've just reported are involved in all these very clandestine activities, and there they are sitting down for dinner with the mayor of your town. It must have been pretty disconcerting.
It was ridiculous. You know, and I flipped the fuck out when I saw them start moving in on my friends. You know, when I was in Troy, at the time, 2007, 2008, I hung out with, you know, a pretty fun crowd, and we were all go out and you know, it was fun. We had a good time, and it was a big crowd. It was probably 15 or 20 people. We all hung out together, and we you know, I can see why they targeted that group of friends. You know, a lot of them went to RPI, graduated from RPI, came from good families, were brilliant. So, of course, NXIVM's going to target them. So, but I knew what they were, and I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't going to let any of my friends get caught up in it. I mean, I even remember having a friend of mine debating me, like, what is a cult and what isn't a cult, and you know, like what, you know, almost like I was exaggerating, you know, or making more out of it than what it is. But you know, so I became very protective of my friends, and I went to each of them, and you know, and I was very explicit to stay away from this. They are not what they seem like. It doesn't matter that they are, you know, because it was Allison Mack and Nikki Klein,
right?
And you know, it doesn't matter that one of them was in your favorite TV show of all time, because I hung out with nerds, right? So it's like, it doesn't matter that she is in Battlestar Galactica. Trust me on this. And they're smart, so they got it. There was one night in particular where we all went out to Daisy Baker's, and Allison Mack, Nikki Klein, and Kristen Keefe, who is a very important member of NXIVM, or was at the time. She was with them. I guess she was like their chaperone. And yeah, so it was the three of them, and then all of my friends. And my friends were very nice, and they're very excited to meet these celebrities. But at the end of the night, you know, after a few drinks, one of my friends had cornered Nikki Klein in the hallway and was like basically yelling at her, "Why are you in a cult?" And
oh man,
yeah. So I was happy to see that, you know, that was the response they got, because it was the response that Troy needed to have. They were very interested in moving into Troy. Why wouldn't they be? I mean, RPI is there. It's access to a lot of money and a lot of young, brilliant people. So it would have been very convenient. And Keith went to RPI, so it was sort of a homecoming of sorts for him. So.
And you were talking about the possibility of writing a book earlier, but you are moving forward, as I understand it, with Tony on a podcast, right?
Yeah.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about when that's coming together and how it will differ from perhaps seeing this talked about on Good Morning America or, Access Hollywood or whatever other shows are?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the thing about Tony and her story is that, she says that, you know, for a lot of people, NXIVM is a story they have. It's a story that's in their life. But for Tony, Keith Raniere has been her life for since 1991. So there's probably no one alive who gets Keith the way Tony gets him. You know, she I joked that if they gave out a PhD for a Keith Raniere, Tony would have one, because she can instinctively guess what he's going to do next. She gets it. She gets it completely, because she's not only did she live with the man and date the man for so long, but she's been one of his main victims for so long. After a while, you just get to know him, and it's not like Tony likes the fact that she's
right.
a Keith Raniere expert, but she is. And so, what we want to do with this podcast, there are a few things. I, as someone who cares about Tony, want to make sure her story gets out fully and without any sort of agenda from the storytelling side. Tony also wants to be a voice for people who are being gaslit, who are victims of abuse, and no one will believe them. It's very important to her to demonstrate through her life how a person can not only be tortured by a person like Keith Raniere, but also then survive it. And then third, we want to expose the flaws in the system. And that's not only the legal system, that's also the political system, because that money didn't just buy them lawyers, it also bought them the elected lawyers, it bought them the politicians too. So there are a lot of names that we will be discussing on that podcast. And there are a lot of people who should be ashamed, and also hopefully maybe scared that this is going to touch them as well. If the feds decide to go further with this and maybe even pursue like a RICO Act charges, who knows where this is going to go.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, we've seen this has already become a political tool, an attack. Kirsten Gillibrand's opponent is attacking her in a race for the Senate, saying that her father represented NXIVM and she should have done something about it. Obviously, we've seen it come up locally a little bit with some local politicians we know took campaign cash. Are you worried at all that this is going to become a political tool, or do you think that's exactly what needs to happen at this point? That's interesting. Tony and I talk about that a lot, actually. The people who are trying to now use this as a weapon, who didn't give, who wouldn't have cared less, right,
2 years ago. So for me, there are axes to grind, and I know what our agenda is. Seeing people attack Gillibrand because her father took money from NXIVM at one point. That I guess is for the public to decide. To me, if that's the extent of Kirsten Gillibrand's involvement, then she is just as guilty as everyone else is for ignoring it. Perhaps because there's no shortage of warnings about this group. But as far as like any sort of complicity, I think that whoever that opponent is of Kirsten's is just reaching at that point,
Right.
But that's such a good point, David, because that's what's so dangerous about this moment, is that we could lose the ability to rightfully hold some people accountable. Because it's going to become the gutter, and everybody's going to get pulled down into it. So Tony and I want to be extraordinarily careful when we come out and say something about this, that we have our target clear, and that we aren't being used by someone else's political agenda.
Right. And so you're still working on it, and we know there are a number of other NXIVM related things in the works. There's a documentary, and we'll probably see some books. But I understand you're probably thinking about this later this year or early next. Is that?
Yeah, well, we're working on it right now. It's funny. Tony and I started talking. Tony and I have talked basically the entire time since we met each other off and on over the past 12 years. But we really started getting back interested in doing something, I think in October or November of last year, when it was like, branding. I think everyone saw the writing on the wall at that point. So we've been working on it for a while, the podcast, and also we will be putting out a book and a podcast essentially around the same time.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, mostly just because the podcast will reach one audience, and then the book will give us the opportunity to sort of like lay out quite a bit more. We're writing currently, and so hopefully we'll have the podcast out this fall.
Okay.
Maybe we'll start. I hate to give any, because who knows what's going to happen with this. I mean, like you said earlier, Claire Bronfman, the person who funds this, is still just walking around, so we have no idea where this is going to go. This is still the very early days. I mean, I guess to everyone else it seems like it's the end, but to me it feels very early in what is happening in the final act for Keith Raniere.
And you and Tony both have a website set up, right? Where people can check in. What is it again? The Fall Podcast?
thefallpodcast.com.
Okay.
And go there, and it's both of our email addresses are on there as well. So if you want to share a story, or if you have information that you would like to get to Tony Natale, you can use that email address there. It's thefallpodcast.com.
And then finally, I just want to, I don't want you to burn any bridges or upset anyone here, but I am interested in just watching this play out to see the different outlets that have gotten involved in covering it. Where do you go for information you trust about this? Is there a particular, anyone that's doing good work on this that you'd recommend?
So my main source of information is Tony always. It's pretty funny. Like, she's like, if you're not following her on Twitter, and you're interested in NXIVM, you definitely should start following Tony on Twitter. I read the Frank Report.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Frank Report is going to be getting you the fastest sort of insider information. Frank Parlato, the person who runs Frank Report, he is definitely very wired in with the NXIVM, the sort of the NXIVM universe. I think that the Times Union is doing some good coverage on it as well. So I will, if Brendan Lyons writes something, I tend to trust Brendan. Outside Times Union aside, I trust Brendan. But Parlato, the Frank Report is definitely the main source of information for me. It's a place I always start, and I know that most people, that's where they're going. And now it's like, it's weird. People come up to me who I wouldn't have thought would know about NXIVM, and they're telling me stuff too. So the story is getting pretty massive. It's strange to watch.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope we can do it again as things sort of play out. And I'm really looking forward to the podcast. I think it'll be really amazing to hear Tony tell her story in that sort of long form fashion, and the book as well. I imagine will be a really good read. It was fun to go back and read a lot of your old stories because obviously you're a good writer. So it's been good.
Coming from you, that's thanks.
Okay.
We're good at this. We're good at complimenting each other.
Yeah, it's not awkward. Not awkward at all. So, the fallpodcast.com, and we'll actually share Tony's handle in the post on this so that folks, and your handle, so that folks can stay abreast of everything. Thanks, Chet, so much. Talk to you soon.
David. Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.